Greetings guys, today with BSTSTech we're hitting the punch a little late with Ryzen, but at the same time we want to talk about it. We've had some things going on the last couple of weeks where we haven't been able to meet, but since then Ryzen has hit the shelves and it's doing amazing things, and it's really starting to disrupt the Intel market as far as going beyond the quad-core processing chips. They're disrupting the prices, they're disrupting the capabilities of it. There's just a lot of stuff that Ryzen's doing really well. However, Ryzen's not doing that well in games.
I got one for you. Ryzen has dropped, but they've kind of dropped the ball.
Well, that would be AMD's fault because they forgot how to do a product launch.
That's true.
But you also have to look at it this way. And this is a theory that I've seen multiple people cultivate over the last couple of weeks, and I think it's kind of got some merit to it. So what AMD did with the Ryzen 7, so the 8-core chips with hyper-threading, is they released the enthusiast workstation grade version of the Ryzen chips and said, alright, we're releasing the platform, we're going to work out all the platform bugs on this decidedly enthusiast chip. And then with the Ryzen 5, we're going to look more at the gamers. Because gamers, if you're building a rig purely based off gaming, your best bet now, even with Ryzen out, is still the 7700K. It's just a phenomenal overclocker. It has the same IPC as Skylake. It's just great for single core performance. And games really aren't able to take care of more than 4 cores anyway. So the idea of having 16, even if they are super high performance cores, say, you know, the 7700K married 2 dies onto a single chip, and you had an 8-core 16 thread 7700K, your games wouldn't benefit from that. They'd still be working off of the first 2 cores of high performance, and then the other 2 would kind of sit there. Or in the dual version, you know, you'd have 6 cores sitting there doing absolutely nothing. So what a lot of us are thinking is that with Ryzen, they're working out the bugs in the 8-core part. By the time the quad-core and the 6-core part in Ryzen 5 shows up, that's where they're going to be able to give you the extreme gaming performance. Because if you look at the die shot, it's two CPUs that are married together. So there are 2 separate catty-cornered sections of the cache, and that's where they're starting to get, with the Windows scheduler, they're getting a lot of performance hits, is because the scheduler is seeing these 2 corners of cache and saying, well, this is one cache, so I'm going to move it from over here to over there, and it doesn't understand there's going to be a penalty for that. So they're having to fix that with the Windows scheduler. Eventually that update will be done. However, the same thing if you look at it from the Ryzen 5, say you have 4 cores with the 2 catty corner caches and have the same 16 megabyte cache that the Ryzen 7 has, it's been proven over and over again that I believe it's for every megabyte of cache that you have, you can make up 100 Hertz in IPC. So effectively, if you have 7700K has what, 8 megabytes of cache of L3?
I don't remember.
Well, let's say that, because I'm pretty sure that's it. That's kind of Intel's standard with their i7s. So it has 8 megabytes of cache, and it has a easily overclockable to 5 gigahertz. Okay, so if you have a IPC that is less on a different chip, i.e. Ryzen 5, but you're able to increase the theoretical megahertz or gigahertz that your processor is running at because you've increased the amount of cache that you have, then suddenly you're competing toe-to-toe with the 7700 on Haswell or Broadwell IPCs, simply because you have more cache. So you have more stuff to store things locally, and L1, L2, and L3 cache is insanely fast. Makes your system RAM look like a mechanical hard drive as far as the speed differentials that these things have. And so when you look at it from that perspective, if you have a crap ton of local storage that you can give to the processing cores, they're not having to do as much moving and redistribution of information that's already done for a single high performance required task like gaming.
Right.
And so suddenly you're able to have, you know, the Ryzen 5s competing toe to toe in a purely gaming scenario, which we've known for years that the Broadwell E line of the i7 6700 or 6900K and the 6950X, the 8 or 6 and 10 core Broadwell E parts, those have never been able to compete toe to toe with the $350 7600K or 7700K. It's never been the case. So why would we expect the Ryzen 8 core systems, you know, from Ryzen 7 to do the exact same thing when the Intel's own offerings at 2, 3, and almost 4 times the price to do the same thing? It's just an uncompetitive decision to compare.
And I think it's worth noting too, I'm going to name drop a little bit.
Yeah, go for it.
I think on Linus's channel, you know, Linus Tech Tips, he talks about that, yeah, the Ryzen 7 1800X, it games pretty well, but it does the what's the word, multitasking extremely well. It's a lot better than, was it the 6950?
6950 is the 10 core $1,800 part. The 6900K is the 6 core $1,000 part.
Okay, so the 6900K. And the point was that even though it does suffer a little bit in gaming compared to one of the, like the 6700 or the 7700K chips, because those chips have only the 4 cores in them, they are terrible at multitasking so much more disproportionately than Ryzen is terrible at gaming.
Right.
So that's something to keep in mind too. And like you said, I think with the new, you know, the Ryzen 5 and the Ryzen 3, right?
Yeah, 3 is going to be competing with like i3 sales.
Right.
So it's going to be the processor that you buy for your parents' machine.
Right.
That is going to last them 5-10 years, but at the same time they don't want to sink a whole lot of money into it. Right. Or you know, those PCs that it's used solely for daily tasks. Kind of like this MacBook. I mean, this is a M3 from the Broadwell line. It doesn't have a whole lot of, you know, it doesn't have the Skylake IPC gains. And for those of you that don't know, I've been saying IPC a lot. IPC is instructions per clock, or per cycle. And so all gigahertz are not created equal. And that's one of the reasons why now we're starting to see this huge battle between AMD and Intel again.
It'll go.
Yeah, it'll go away. We'll cut this out.
Oh, we don't have to cut it out.
Oh, we don't have to cut it out? Okay.
No, why not?
I don't care.
Eventually this will be live, maybe.
Right. Oh, so we're going to compete with the WAN show.
Let's not do the WAN show. I think it would be cool to turn this into a live thing, because if we have people actually communicating with us and interacting, we can get a lot more out of it. And
but at the same time, it is funny because last night, specifically on the WAN show, Linus talked directly about this idea of people licensing the WAN show for like a French version and a Chinese version and these different things. Funnier than snot that came up today, specifically because he talked about that last night. It was like, no, this is not unique. We copied it off somebody else and I never even watched it before. So yeah, it's just funny. But at any rate, so IPC is instructions per clock or per cycle, whichever one you want to do, it doesn't matter. So all gigahertz are not the same. But because the only thing we've had since Bulldozer from the AMD rig is nothing. Intel's been making small IPC gains across their i7 series processors, and we've been able to benchmark that throughout those years, you've seen it, you know, online as tech tips and all sorts of other gaming benchmarks to where, you know, the Ivy Bridge or the Haswell and Broadwell, you know, it does get incrementally better. It is able to handle more CPU intensive games with each generation across identical parts. Not identical parts, but competing parts in the Intel stack. But, you know, because Bulldozer is 6 years old at this point, came out in 2011, it's just kind of stagnant. So no one's been testing AMD rigs because we've seen what it's capable of. You slap it with a bare GPU, well, guess what? You slapped it with a bare GPU, you're still going to have the same CPU bottleneck that you would otherwise. So now, with Ryzen, we're actually able to see a difference in IPC gains, and hopefully the L3 cache that they're putting into the Ryzen chips will lay over in the Ryzen 5 chips and really give them that ability to take care of the pure gaming performance. But at the same time, if you look at Ryzen 7 from the perspective of a workstation or something that's not solely for gaming, like my rig at home, I do much more productivity work off of that machine, even though it is an FX8350, and even though recently this week I did put an all-in-one cooler on it because I had one of those little crappy stock fans which was louder than the devil.
Louder than the devil?
Louder than the, yeah. Like, it was...
I didn't know the devil was loud.
Well, okay, so the cooler that was on there, like that I've had on there for over a year now, literally would fit in a 2U server. Like, it's tiny little heat sink. And the... Yep. Any of you that have heard of server rack, it's the same thing. It's just this god-awful noise. And so even when it was sitting there idle, that fan would just be cranking around because the blades were so small, it was just louder and snot. It just got on my ever-loving nerves. So I finally put a water cooler because the Noctua D15 that I wanted, Noctua's dual fan solution, wouldn't fit with my 32 gigs of RAM, and I didn't want to lose any of those. But at any rate, with that machine, I do a lot more productivity on it than gaming. And so because of that, having the 8 cores, even in a Bulldozer architecture, is much more important to me to have that multitasking capability. At one point in time, I have 4 monitors plugged up to the thing, and I can do that through the Sapphire RX 470 that I have in there. And I had, what, 15 different applications running at one time, and it was just handling it like a champ. Now, that stupid little heatsink was still going off like, you know, it thought the sky was falling, but as far as performance, and as far as, you know, the CPU getting hot, it wasn't doing anything critical. It was great. Went for days. I was running multiple VMs. I was doing compiling of software, running way too many tabs. So, yes, you know, when you look at where AMD's been, you look where AMD is going, you look at Intel, with this thing, I'm begged the question of how much do we actually need? It's been an experiment where, you know, I put some money on the table to figure out that answer. And unless you're gaming, in all honesty, unless you're gaming, you don't need more than 2.5 gigahertz. There's just nothing. I did a project, what was it, Thursday night this week, where I had to render a 1080p YouTube video for a class. 8 minutes long, took this thing 20 minutes.
Wow.
And the whole time it was rendering, I was going about my normal stuff. I had my standard email client open, the Mac messaging app, the calendar app. I had all my background stuff going the entire time. At one point in time, I had like 12 tabs in Safari open. I had my terminal open. Like, I was continuing to do my thing. Never noticed any performance problems. And it was running, and this is the fun part, it was doing extra stress because it was actually outputting to a 1080p ultra-wide monitor. Never had a problem. No stuttering, no weirdness. And so I look at this from a standpoint of what do we actually need for daily processing, And the reality is, an M3 from the Broadwell I-Series, that's all anybody needs, unless you're gaming.
So let's talk about the gaming side of it and multitasking though.
Mm-hmm.
So you said 6 years since AMD put out anything.
Mm-hmm.
So in the past 6 years, game development has changed significantly, and it's the way they do things. And if all they've really had to worry about realistically is Intel as far as optimizations and all of that, then that's what these games are going to be optimized for.
Right.
So, and it's been thrown out there that you know, they're not taking advantage of the multi-threading that they could be, right?
But yes and no. You've got to look at it from this standpoint. So there are multiple tests that I've watched that have done SMT on, which is SMT is Ryzen's version of hyperthreading, which oddly enough in productivity tasks under Linux works better than Intel's hyperthreading.
Wow.
Which is amazing to me. Absolutely floored me when I saw the stuff for it. But this is beside the point. So with SMT, it is hyperthreading, and if any of you that have watched Linus's Tech Quickie on hyperthreading, it's effectively feeding your mouth M&Ms with 2 hands instead of 1. That's all hyperthreading is. So with SMT on, you're not getting necessarily any extra performance, but you're not getting any less performance because SMT is on. And yes, as time goes by, you know, the APIs like Vulkan and DirectX 12 and different things, in addition to the actual software development packages like Unity and I forget what the other big one is, Unreal Engine, those will figure out how to better optimize their C and C++ code to work with these extra things at the chip architecture level, because yes, they have only had Intel to look at, and Intel has been going with the idea that gamers do not need, and enthusiasts, consumers do not need more than 4 cores with hyperthreading to do any task they need. So they've been taking the low-hanging fruit of upping the IPCs and making those boost. The next low-hanging fruit is the increasing the L3 cache. So here's the thing that I question. One of the things you noticed when you were watching the AMD launch videos, Thursday, February 22nd or something.
Yeah.
I forget when it was.
I think that was the
one of the things you saw were very cherry-picked battles that AMD did. But they offered interesting questions. So one of those battles in particular that a lot of people are looking at is the idea that Intel's idea of having fewer higher performing cores doesn't give you the ability to run a game at high frames, you know, competitive frames, i.e. 120 frames plus, and stream that from a single system. What having 8 cores with hyperthreading gives you the ability to do, suddenly you have that. So you don't have to build 2 systems to do streaming and play your games at a competitive level. You can do that off one system now with Ryzen. And yeah, you're taking a little bit of performance hit because you don't have, you know, the single core performance that an i7 6700K or 7700K would. But you're still getting a lot of bang for your buck because you don't have to buy a second $300 or $400 motherboard. You don't have to buy more DDR4 RAM, which you can get 64 gigs of DDR4 for like $400. So if you space that into one machine, that's $400 you spend once, whereas otherwise you're looking at 16 across 2, and you're looking about $200-300 per machine for that. So there's a lot of arguments to be made that having one machine is better than having 2, but at the same time, if you want to stay strictly with Intel, you can do the 2 machine route and have a lot more work to do, a lot more power draw out of your wall, and different things to deal with. But for those of us that don't have, you know, thousands of dollars to waste, I'd rather have one machine.
You said that.
Because you make more money than I do. You make a lot more money than I do.
Well.
You were able to build that in what, a month?
3-4 months.
Okay. I spent $500 and got the base FX8350 running. I spent $200 6 months later and got a graphics card for the base system, which actually had borrowed hard drives. Well, not really borrowed, but they were like 6-year-old drives, so they could fail at any moment. I knew that. And then recently I spent another $200 for a 3 terabyte drive, mechanical drive, and a 500 gig SSD. So I haven't broke $1,000 yet. That behemoth is approaching 2, correct?
Yeah.
And it's an i7 6700K.
Which I bought like 2 months before they released Kaby Lake.
Yeah, I'm not even going to touch that. Your shame will deal with it.
But okay, so here's the thing though. You know, if you look at the performance per dollar on the 6700 and the 7700Ks, you're really not getting that much.
What you're getting is a stable overclock.
I don't overclock anyway.
Well, that's because you're a loser. I'm sorry, you don't spend $350 on a chip and not overclock it.
I haven't had the need to overclock it.
And that's my argument as to why you don't need it.
I wanted it.
Well, if you had waited a few extra months, you could have an 8-core 16-thread part. Now, granted,
I may still have one of those anyway.
Yes, I will say this. To a degree, there is wisdom in sticking with Intel right now, because you don't have the first time, the day one adopters issues of having to debug the Windows scheduler, because Intel was screwy a couple, 10 years ago, and AMD's just kind of, they're sheepish. You have no idea what I'm talking about, do you?
Not exactly.
Okay, so back in the mid-2000s, Intel was releasing the Pentium D. Like, that was their flagship part for, your standard desktop.
Okay.
AMD had the Athlon, and it hands down was better than the Pentium D. No questions asked, you could not refute it. However, Intel would go to their partners and pay them to not use AMD's part. And so in Europe, it got brought up kind of like on monopoly charges or whatever. Intel got brought up and they were sued. They lost the suit and they owe AMD millions. And still to this day, they haven't paid a penny. Or if they have paid the absolute minimum to keep themselves out of having to deal with it. Wow. So, Intel is a squirrely little meh. I don't have a whole lot good to say. Now, granted, that is the one and only time, to my knowledge and anybody else's knowledge that I'm aware of, that they have done something like this. At the same time, because of that one decision, AMD's financial stability has been on the rocks ever since. That's why Bulldozer was the best thing they could do for years, because they simply didn't have the money for the R&D to be able to compete with Intel in their own game. After they lost so much of the market share, Intel became known as such a household stable name. Like, my mom, even to this day, will not buy AMD. Under no circumstances will she have anything AMD. And I've handed her, computers and whatnot that are AMD. And she didn't notice it until I said something about it. It's like, so, how about the AMD? And she was like, what? Yeah, it's got AMD. I don't want it. And it's just like, because you had people that did that, that developed that name for the difference between AMD and Intel, because AMD got gimped by bad business practices from Intel 10 years ago.
Right.
And it's just like, that's underhanded as all get out. Like, that is just terrifyingly sad.
I'm looking this up so we don't get sued for libel.
We can't get sued.
I'm not that I don't trust you,
Oh,
But
you don't trust me.
I'm just wanting to verify this now.
Yeah.
And that way, if we need to cut it out later, we can. But
I mean, like Dell came out and said that they accepted bribes not to use AMD.
Okay.
This is common knowledge to everybody but you, apparently. I can't say much. Like, I didn't know about this until 2 years ago. So, I mean, it's one of those quirky things. It's one of those things in the industry you never think to look back 10, 20 years ago to see what happened in the business world in technology. You're just looking at, well, I want a new PC. What part do I want? It's like, well, Intel's the only one that has anything competitive. Or you can buy an 8-core part that gives you the ability to multitask. And going back to the Ryzen 7, the 8 cores gives it the ability to multitask, but it makes it a very smooth experience. That is one of the words that everybody I've seen use says about it. They just say it's very smooth. There's no hiccups. There's none of this random stuttering when you start having heavy workloads. And that I find to be really interesting because that's one of the reasons why I started adopting SSDs. Because I wanted the snappy smoothness, and you can get away with not having as powerful a processor, again, while still having, very fast storage. Makes a very snappy experience. Makes it very smooth.
There's one thing I'd like to add to that too. You were talking about the AMD launch video,
where they were doing like the 3 hours of, comparison shots and different things.
And it's floated around a lot out there. I mean, pretty much all the big channels are talking about it. One of their demos showed the 1800X beating the 6900K, I think it was.
And it did.
In gaming.
Yes.
Now, the problem with that is that it was all 4K gaming.
Yes.
And a lot of the independent reviews after the launch are showing that Ryzen is not beating them in the 1080p gaming, but at the 4K level, they are performing pretty much on par. And of course, the reason for that is the GPU bottleneck.
Yes,
and I think that's
able
important.
to bottleneck things a little bit more. However, yes, it is important, and yes, it's good to know about that. But the general masses will do 1080p gaming, and that's just obvious. Like, they're going to be doing that till the cows come home, forever and ever, amen, because we're broke. Yay!
Well,
but also think about it this way. When you see competitive gamers, or when you see people that are doing live streams or whatever, they're going out and buying 4K monitors. You were talking about buying, a 2K monitor.
Right.
Why do you want such a big monitor if you're not actually going to push an equal resolution, content to it?
Well, right. And I mean, the point I was trying to get at, though, is that if you already have a 4K setup, and your graphics cards, whether, it's just something that's never occurred to you or whatever, are already bottlenecking what's going to it,
Why are you going to buy a new card, a new chip?
Well,
well, I mean, that would be my question. Like, if you're running a 7700K, you already have it liquid cooled, and you're overclocking it to a steady 5 gigahertz, and you're running, say, dual 1080s, you can handle 4K for days. But why would you even be looking at Ryzen?
Well, I would think that anybody who just bought a 7700K is not looking to upgrade their system.
Exactly. But those are the same people that are crying bloody murder that AMD cheated and that, the Ryzen 7 chips don't handle gaming and whatnot. It's like, well, the same crazy turds that are screaming bloody murder about how it doesn't have higher frame rates are the same ones that aren't going to be using an 8-core part anyway. So why do they care? But they're still screaming bloody murder about it.
Right. Well,
because it's a workstation chip. Like, in all honesty, the only way to get an Intel offering that would be equivalent to Ryzen 7 would literally be to either buy old 8-core Xeons or spend $1,000 plus on Broadwell e-consumer chips.
But you would
I
have
just
to
don't
have
care.
a... What's the socket type on the... like the 6900K?
6900K.
Is it the
It's
2011?
either
The
2011 V3 or it's the 1151. I know 1151 is the Cabby Lake, but that may have been used for Skylake too. I don't know.
Yeah.
Because I look at the prices on Intel's motherboards and it's like, oh no, pass. Like that stuff's expensive, and I like having a lot of hard drives.
So let's back up a little bit then on the 4K thing.
Okay.
So, you know, I have the RX 480.
Mm-hmm.
And
8GB version.
yes,
Correct.
it does well for me, but I do have an Intel-based motherboard and processor. You know,
6700K.
Yes.
That you don't overclock. Paid $100 extra to overclock the frickin' thing, and you haven't done it yet.
Anyway, well, I haven't done a water cooling loop yet, and I want to get into that. But
my head is the size of your heatsink.
yeah,
I don't think you're gonna have a problem.
so anyway, for me,
Yes.
what excites me about Ryzen and the 1800K is
1800X.
1800X. Sorry,
It gets squirrely. I know. It's weird.
so I kind of want to build an AMD system now.
Right.
And if I'm going to do it, of course, I mean, it's infinitely cheaper than going Intel, obviously.
Oh yeah. My
But
question: why is the 1800X your go-to chip from the lineup? Like, why is that the one that excites you?
because the 1700X and the 1700, they are priced, they're not much cheaper than the Intel equivalents.
Okay, your chip currently, the 6700K, currently is going on Newegg for $340.
The 7700 is $349. The 6700 is $329, I thought.
Oh,
No?
it's only $10 cheaper.
Oh.
I was looking at this the other day. But regardless, I mean, even if it's $30 difference, for $330, you're gonna have 8 cores, 16 threads. I don't see that in any way, shape, or form matching that chip. I don't, like, when you look at price to performance, I see the advantage of future proofing by having those higher clocks. Because when you look at Vulkan, you look at DirectX, their entire purpose for existing, and of course they're being slowly adopted, but their entire purpose for existing is this concept that we need to parallelize tasks inside of our computer programs because we're running out of places to go on a simple clock system. We need to be able to spread across more cores that are slower and get a task done quicker and better because we can't go any higher. Like, there's a reason why 5 gigahertz on Cabby Lake is so impressive, because up until then the FX8350 was the only thing that got that far. But the only reason why I was able to do that, and the only reason why that lineup was able to do it, is simply because it was already an overheated part to begin with. So the idea of pushing it an extra gigahertz, like, it had the power conditioning built into it to be able to handle that kind of thing. But with the IPC, it just didn't have it. So it can't compete on an architecture 6 years down the road. But once you get past 5 gigahertz, it's like, well, I mean, we can't really do that much anymore. Like, this idea of a single core that goes lightning speed, that just doesn't work. We're running out of ways to deal with it because we can't make the chips smaller. Like, right now we're at 14 nanometers. Supposedly Cannon Lake's going to be 10 nanometers. But we're, like, that's getting almost to the single digits. How much smaller can we legitimately make this stuff before the silicon itself isn't enough of a barrier in between electrical lines to keep the electron from jumping over into another line and causing catastrophic CPU failure.
Right.
Like, we're getting to a point to where we're shafted. Like, we're running out of stuff to do. We can't make it smaller. So there's some serious questions there, and one of the things with Ryzen that has been out there is with liquid, or I think it was liquid nitrogen cooling. They've pushed it to 5 gigahertz easy and beyond. So I mean, maybe our next step in performance is using a different type of cooling. So instead of it being air cooled or water cooled, maybe our next step is to do liquid nitrogen cooling, because we can't make the chips better themselves, so we'll simply cool them better. I mean, quantum chips, they exist, but they have to be at negative 200 something C, or 400. I think it was 400 C. But either way, it's stupid cold. Like, no. Like, there's no way on God's green earth that is ever gonna become this.
It'd be like having to have an extra room in your house for your nitrogen production.
Really. I mean, it takes the idea of Linus's water cooling room to a whole new level. Like, just the concept of doing quantum computing in its current state in everybody's home is ridiculous. And yeah, liquid nitrogen is very dangerous. You can do a lot of damage with it to the human body. But we're kind of running out of options. So that's why Vulkan and DirectX 12 are looking to throw more of the gaming workload across more cores. So you stop having these bottlenecks from having CPU single cores that just can't run fast enough. And so it's a matter of time before the $330 R7 1700 is going to hands down beat the 7700K, because you're going to start having games that have so many different things going on that the CPU has to track that it just can't. It doesn't matter how fast those individual cores are. It just can't keep up. So to me, when you look, especially right now and in the coming months, at building a PC, yeah, even if you are solely looking at gaming, yeah, go Intel if you want to go Intel. But if you're comfortable using AMD, if you're comfortable going to Ryzen, I don't see the 1800X as a valid option because it's $500. I mean, I built my entire rig minus the GPU and hard drive updates for $500. I can't justify spending an entire PC's worth of money on the chip. But $330 and then $200 for a good motherboard like the Tai Chi, that's a compelling option, because that's the motherboard and the chip for the same price, well, $30 discrepancy as the 1800X. You can still put the same 64 gig DDR4 limit on it. You can have the same number, of SATA ports that you have connected to it. But compare that against doing an Intel 7700K rig, $350 for the chip, $200+ for the motherboard, and then you're sitting there when Vulkan actually becomes good, going, oh crap. The $20 cheaper 8-core part from AMD is beating me. I mean, that day is coming.
Well, I might consider the 1700X.
I don't see the extended range frequency being worth anything. Like, it's a cool little thing, but I think that needs time to mature. Because remember, this is Gen 1 of Ryzen.
But I thought you couldn't overclock the 1700, but you can unclock it.
All Ryzen chips are overclockable. They're all unlocked multipliers. The difference is the 1700X and the 1800X has XFR, which is extended frequency range. So if the motherboard UEFI is set to auto, giving the chip license to do whatever it wants to do, however it sees fit. And if you have adequate cooling, say with the 1800X, its normal cap is 4 gigahertz. And of course, silicon lottery plays into this, but its normal cap is 4 gigahertz. If it sees that you have enough cooling, and if it decides that you need the extra workload, it will push an extra 100 megahertz. And I want to say that's only on like 1 or 2 cores. It's not even across the entire chipset. So I don't see that right now in particular as really that great of a thing. Like if you're looking for a high core count, high individual core performance, then yeah, by all means go for it. Do the 1800X. But if you're doing it specifically because you think that the XFR is some amazing God's gift to humanity or whatever, go with the 1700. Yeah, wait a generation or two, see how it irons out. I mean, like I was saying before, the SMT is already better than Intel on how it's able to parallelize, the feeding of the cores, and so I would say the 1700X, or if you want to wait for the Ryzen 5 and get a 6-core part, which should be cheaper than the 1700X again. I mean, if you want to run a lot of small tasks, or if you want to run a couple of very large tasks, getting these high core count chips is really going to be important. Or if you just simply want to build a single PC, put enough money into it now, like $1,200, and just be set for the next 10 years, get the 8-core part. No questions asked. If you just want a workstation machine that will last the next 10 years, get the 8-core part. 1700 all the way. Okay. Now I am curious because the die shot of the Ryzen 7 chips shows that it's 2 chips married together on a single piece of silicon. So I'm really curious if AMD is going to allow motherboard manufacturers to make a dual processor motherboard. That would just be amazing to me. I would absolutely love it, and that's worth spending $700 for a 16-core, 32-thread home build. At the same time, if you do want to stick with Intel, and you still want to have a high core count, that's my background. Oh, okay. Yeah, I got nerdy the other day. I've done this for 2 weeks, and Marvin looked at me the other day and was just like, "What is that?" I was like, "Well, don't worry about it. You're not nerdy enough to understand."
And that's
my boss. Yeah. So here's the fun thing. So going to Newegg the other day, I was looking at things. I was like, well, what if I wanted to make a competitor for Ryzen out of Intel? So obviously I have to go with Xeon if I want 8 cores with hyper-threading. Newegg has a brand new chip for $415. It is a Xeon E5 2690. It is an 8-core part, 3.1 gigahertz base clock, 3.8 turbo. So obviously a very good piece of silicon, works out really well, can handle, because it's a Xeon, you can put multiple, you can get dual proc motherboards. $415. So you're looking at less than $100 more than the 1700, and you're getting slightly better performance. And it's still Intel for anybody that likes Intel but wants to do it. And then the cheapest motherboard that would work with it, that actually had decent specs and whatnot, was $200. So again, on par with the Tai Chi, which is just my favorite of the motherboards so far that are released, because it's more of a workstation build motherboard anyway. It looks cool. Yeah, it does look cool. And so
I do know what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, you should. There's only like 8 motherboards right now for Ryzen. It's kind of easy to keep up with. So I mean, and then all the other parts are the same. Now, granted, it's running DDR3 RAM, so I mean that's going to be a price difference. But if you're doing a Xeon, you might as well go ahead and up it to the ECC if you can. But I mean, that would make a very compelling argument to stick with Intel and still have a future-proofed system in terms of gaming with productivity in mind. So I mean, there's some very fun things out there. And I do find, I mean, I'm not dogging Intel. I don't think Intel's a bad company. I think Intel has had too much of the market share for too long, and they've simply gotten complacent. But we shall see. I like a lot of the stuffs that are out there. The only thing I don't like about AMD's Ryzen right now, something we were talking about earlier, because again, I'm not a Windows guy. I want to do Windows for my gaming and my gaming only, but at the same time, if I could run that in a virtual machine, I would like to. And so something that you have to look at and something that's required to deal with GPU pass-through to a virtual machine is the IOMMU groups. And currently, the IOMMU groups are set up to where the two 3.0 by 16 PCI Express slots are on the same group. And because they're on the same group, you can't initialize one and pass it to your virtual machine. So it does kind of cause a little bit of a problem. It should be able to be fixed in software, but we're just going to have to wait and see if AMD actually does that. So between that and the dual processor motherboard, those are the two things I'm really looking to see AMD release and allow in their AM4 platform. Because once those two get done, there's no reason that I can see not to use it. You know, anybody that wants to do coding, anybody that wants to do you know, just a massive amount of stuff at one point in time, I mean, there's no Xeon that really bang for its buck could compete with something like that. Especially if the SMT is truly better. And if under Linux, which, you know, of course is what I would be using, actually I'd be using FreeBSD, but that's the point. If under these Unix platforms you can get better performance in compiling code and in running virtual machines, because one of the things I'm seeing and I'm hearing a lot about is that if you run a lot of virtual machines off of Ryzen CPU, when you overtask that CPU, it handles the overscheduling of its resources really well. Whereas with Intel, I've seen those crash. Like, you peg that stuff at 100% and ask it to do more, it just kind of stutters and poops out. Like, I've seen that more times than I can shake a stick at with i7s. Whereas apparently, and again apparently, with Ryzen, you can overtask it all day long. Because AMD put in patches in the Linux kernel ahead of time before the launch, so that Linux had much less problems from the operating system than Windows did. They didn't want to work that much with Windows, and I think a lot of that has to do with them being burned by Intel so many years ago. But they wanted to get groups to adopt. They wanted to get the enthusiasts and the workstation people, and, you know, the geeks, as it were, that, you know, are willing to sit there and do patches and work through and do squirrely things to their operating system to get, you know, things to work smoother. They want them to adopt it and take it and really run with it, and then they'll get the gamers and, you know, normal people, normies or whatever. Well, I mean, someone that would sit there and literally you could give them a Chromebook and they could do everything that they wanted to do on it. They just wouldn't be as comfortable because it's a new learning curve. So, and that's really what Ryzen 5 and Ryzen 3 should be aimed toward. We'll see after they release it what it's actually capable of. But from the way it's looking and the way the stack is being presented to us now, I really see that being the way it is. You know, 7 is purely high task, you know, high multi-threading stuff. You know, 5 is more of the gamer individual core performance, and 3 is more of the everyday common usage type scenario. But we'll see. I'm kind of curious to see where they're going to go and if they're actually going to deliver. Because they can really easy gimp their entire system. Like if Ryzen 5 does not have a high L3 cache, done. Pack it in. Forget it. AMD is just going to spend a lot of money on a bunch of fanfare, and they're not going to have a quad-core part that competes with Intel on any way, shape, or form. And that's just not going to be good for anybody.
Well, I'll admit, kind of changing gears. You know, I play one game currently, so I'm not a gamer yet. Well, I'm technically a gamer, but
I'm a dirty casual, so I can't say anything. I mean, I have a 470, and it's so much better than my chip, you know, my CPU can handle, which is hilarious. It's not. But at the same time, I built that machine to be a server. The fact it plays games is just because I didn't want to have spent so much money on games and then not be able to play any of them. Like, this is the only reason why that thing has a graphics card.
Well, so as me not caring that much about super high performance in games, and you know, my focus is on the data center and working in that environment, servers and all that. Naples excites me.
Oh, I don't want to get my hopes up, but yes, Naples looks amazing.
Because if they do allow dual processor motherboards,
they will. They've already shown that it will. Yeah.
Okay.
Like, that's the point. So the point of it is that you have two 32-core, 64-thread CPUs with full 32 sticks of RAM. And they're trying to optimize the motherboard so that that RAM can feed those CPUs and really be able to handle a high throughput. So they're throwing this more toward the crap, I forgot the word.
Enterprise?
No, well, I mean, it's toward the enterprise, but it's more of the machine learning. That's what it is. They're throwing this more toward machine learning as a CPU that can handle and keep up with having a multi-GPU setup to do a lot of number crunching and have a lot of input-output. But at the same time, when you look at this as a web server, like, how many machines have, you know, I've seen 16-blade servers where each blade had 2 Xeons, quad-core, hyper-threaded, 2.2 max gigahertz, and a lot of RAM. The idea is they wanted to handle as much input and output as they could to handle web services. Google servers, they're basically R710s, Dell R710s. So that's a PowerEdge 2U rack system, has 8 hard drive slots in it. Those had 2 6-core hyper-threaded Xeons in them. Every one of them. I sent out probably 800 at least personally at one of my last jobs. And the thing is, those had 4 gigabit Ethernet ports in the back. And those search appliances, those servers, are exactly what you interface with. They're what's run the PHP and everything when you go to google.com and you make that search request. It's what deals with that, interfaces with the caching servers and the data storage servers and different things to be able to pull information to present to you. And so the idea is, if you can have a 2U system, or even a 1U system, which supposedly Naples is supposed to be able to fit into, that has more cores than 8, well, I guess it wouldn't be 8. Let's see, 32, 64, so 64 divided by 12, that's somewhere in the neighborhood of 5. So if you can replace 5 2U servers with 1 2U server, and handle the same input and output by upgrading the NICs to 10 gigabit or 40 gigabit NICs, you've just saved a ton of space in your data system, in your data server or data center. Center.
There you go.
Well, a lot of words, really quick. I'm gonna screw up. But at any rate, like the amount of replacement that you're able to do from that kind of an upgrade is just years ahead of what Intel was going to do with their Xeon lines.
Right.
Because you can get high core count, low frequency Xeons that are approaching, they're like 22 cores right now, and they're thousands of dollars for a single chip. To do that in a dual server, you're looking at $20K just for a couple of servers, not to mention the entire rack that you're trying to replace. Oh, yeah. So it's just not cost effective. But at the same time, they also have a $10,000 chip, which is, I want to say like a quad core part, and just has like 80 megabytes of L3 cache.
Oh
it's
gosh.
ridiculously amazing, but it's 10 grand. And the reason was because L1, L2, and L3 cache are the most expensive parts of your CPU, which is interesting because it's the fastest RAM we have. Like L1 is the fastest RAM that we've ever designed, but for whatever reason, somehow and how it's made, it has like a 8 kilobyte max or something like that. And then L2 is a little bit slower, but it's able to handle more. And L3 is a little bit slower than that, but obviously we've figured out how to expand how much we can have of it. And so now with L3 cache, it's just a matter of how much money do you want to spend. But to replace an entire data center worth of systems with these Xeon parts that are 22 cores and do dual of those, I mean, you're easily gaining millions quickly, which these companies don't want to do. They want to spend a couple of K per server, every day, as opposed to, 10 or 20 or 30K for a single server to replace 5 servers, because now they're going to sell them at a deficit and they just don't make the return on their investment. So hopefully Naples will be absolutely and utterly amazing.
How much do you think it'll cost? Have they given you any kind of indication?
I haven't seen anything that says anything about price. Now it's not supposed to come out until the second quarter of this year, so that could be any time between now and June. So we will just have to wait and see. I have no idea what they're going to do.
I hope it's cheap.
No,
I don't really want to build a server.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you could do some of their older server parts. They've got a 12-core part that is non-hyper-threaded. And this is where it kind of gets crappy. It's a 6000 series. And they've got dual and quad core or quad socket motherboards for these types of chips. But you can get a 12-core part for like $300-400. The problem is it doesn't break through gigahertz.
Ugh.
Yeah, so I mean, you can handle a lot of flow, but what would you do with it? Right. Unless you're running a web server or something, it's not going to be worth it.
Yeah.
So that is one of the downsides with when you start looking at enterprise equipment, is it's made to handle a lot of input and a lot of output, but those individual core counts just suck. They're so slow.
Well, I mean, I guess in theory you could also just use a Ryzen 1700 or 1800 as a server chip.
Yeah. I mean, that's what the FX series was. It was a server chip that they simply gimped a little bit and gave to consumers.
Now you said that, I think you had said, I don't know if you said it while we were talking here or if we were talking over there.
We talk everywhere.
The donut shop where this all started.
Oh, yeah.
But before we get too far off that, what was I saying?
I don't know. You said something that I talked about, and that's as far as you got.
Oh, the 1700s.
Yes.
Are they going to be capable of dual processor motherboards?
We don't know.
Okay.
That's one of the things. AMD has not said anything about doing a dual processor AM4 platform motherboard. that doesn't preclude it. It may mean that the X370 chipset and the B350 chipsets on the motherboards just simply can't handle the throughput that dual CPUs would handle. So they would need a third chipset for the AM4 platform. Or it may be that they just, because they rush the server, or because they rush the motherboard manufacturers to produce a product so quickly, they just didn't have time to flesh that out and actually do it. And it's something in the works that's coming. Kind of like with BioStar's ITX motherboard that they just came out with for the AM4 platform this week. Up until this week, we'd only seen micro ATX and full ATX, but we haven't seen extended ATX or XL ATX or ITXs. Well, now we have an ITX. And so it may just be one of those things where it's in the works and we'll get there. But at the same time, as far as the difference between the three chips themselves, the 1700, 1700X, and 1800X, whatever one can do, they all should be able to do, with the exception of the XFR, which is only on the top two, as delineated by the X in the name. So we'll see. I don't know. I would love to see a dual core or a dual socket motherboard come out for AM4. That would just be amazing.
Well, if they did that though, would anybody... Let's compare the Ryzen, let's say the 1800X, it's $500, to what is the next comparable server chip from Intel that would be 8 core, 16 threads. I mean, I think you had said something around what, $1,000, $2,000 probably?
They're not cheap. Well, I mean, just to keep me from Googling in front of you live, let's just go with this 450. And so let's compare that against the 1700X. So the 1700X has the XFR, so it can boost a little bit higher. But its frequency responses are very similar to the E5 2690. Now the 2690 is 415, the 1700X is 400. So we're talking about a $15 difference between the two. Even if you did that, the simple reality is that chip is running off the 2011 version 1 socket. That is a Haswell socket. So it's already got the same IPC that Ryzen does.
Oh, and that's an older generation Xeon.
That's an older generation Xeon.
Okay, so
it's not even new.
Okay.
Literally, these chips, I believe, within the year will be coming out of data centers. So it's a matter of, well, eventually it will flood the market just like the 2670s did a summer or two ago, where they were going for like each chip was like $25. But again, that was a used chip, and that is a chip that had been through a lot of work. So the chances of it, there's a reason why they call it end of life. That thing ran 24/7 for days on end for years. Because I believe it was 2012 or 2013 when those were brand new on the market. So you think it's been through 3 or 4 years of 24/7 operation, it may have another 5 years in it of consumer level work. Or you start running, the most stressful game you can stick on it, it may just fry. So that is the problem with going with older Xeons. They had their life. And that's one of the reasons why I found the Newegg one so compelling, because it was a brand new chip that hadn't been through all the work. So it's a compelling argument.
The thought process, the thought experiment I was getting at there is that Naples is going to be more expensive than Ryzen, I would imagine.
Oh, of course.
So...
because it's going toward companies that have bigger pockets than we do.
But if the Naples chips, the Naples processor are a whole lot more expensive than Ryzen, but Ryzen still functions adequately in a server environment, because of the amount of cores in it,
Right.
then if they produced we'll say a server style motherboard, and by that I mean like a dual processor socket or a quad processor socket, then they could be undercutting themselves a little bit, because, you know, if the Ryzen chip can fit into one of these these boards and still perform on par with a more expensive Intel chip, or at least, like I said, adequately, why would they necessarily need to go up to the Naples?
Because with the data center and what they're trying to push, they're essentially going off the same prospect that they did with the FX series. So with the FX series, the idea was more cores is better than fewer high-performing cores. You know, it's the same argument they've had for years, and now we're getting to a point where the software is actually catching up with that ideology. And so if you look at Naples and say the base chip of Naples that has the 32 cores, 64 threads, has a base clock of, say, 2 gigahertz, turbo to 2.8. And none of this, other than the core count and thread count, is confirmed. Let's say that chip has 2 megabytes of cache, L3 cache per core. So that would be 64 megabytes of L3 cache. That's already expensive, because to do that kind of a thing, you're competing with Intel's 80 megabyte L3 cache on a quad core chip that's 10 grand. So to do that, let's say they were able to concoct some weird way to bring that down to $2,000 per chip. For you and me, that is ridiculous. No way. Cards are off the table at that point. For a data center, or for, say, a community, company that understands and has the kind of input that would need that, if I could replace 8 servers or 10 servers with this one for $4 grand a chip, for $4 grand for 2 chips plus the rest of the server, say $15K, I know your company has spent more than that. It's a compelling argument, because the thing we were talking about the other day with your blade server, 4 blades, internal SSDs, the whole 9 yards. You don't have the same functionality that one server does, and you spent more on it. So there's a lot of argument to be made here that if they can make the Naples chips with the high core counts cheap enough, and it's actually able to perform, then they're golden. Like, there's no way at this point that Intel can compete with that without completely redoing their entire marketing scheme. Now, to jump back to something, you want to know what an equivalent Xeon of a current generation would be? This is not a current generation. This is the Broadwell generation, so it's 2 generations old. As far as Xeons are concerned, it's only 1 generation old. This would compete with the 1700X and the 1600X. Refurbished.
1600X?
Or 1800X, my bad. Refurbished, $1,500 for
Holy
a 6-core hyper-threaded 20 megabytes of L3 cache and 3.4 base clock on each of those cores.
So if I were to buy an 1800X or 1700X and shove those in a board, I would be better off to do that way and come out $1,000 cheaper.
Yep. And not only that, the TDP on this Xeon is 135 watts.
And it's what, 90 on the Ryzen?
90 or 95 on the Ryzen X chips. On the 1700, it's 65. I mean,
so it's,
to me, that's a no contest, and that's exactly what the Ryzen 7 was built to do. It was built to take all of these rigs that are running Xeons or running high core count Intel parts, for enthusiasts and say, hey, we don't want that anymore. We're going to give you a cheaper part, which gives you the same performance for less price. Because Ryzen does support ECE or ECC RAM, so it can compete with the Xeons. And it just, I mean, that's a hard argument to beat. Even if you are the occasional gamer. I know we've hashed this to high heaven and back, but there's a lot. And it really does. This is the first thing that has interrupted the flow of money in the computer, in enthusiast and low-end servers for a long time. AMD's RX 400 series kinda interrupted the graphics market a little bit, but really it just gave AMD a reason to be bought over NVIDIA.
It was cheaper.
Well, I mean, it was cheaper, and for $400 you could get two reference 480s that would compete toe-to-toe with a $700 or an $800 1080 out of the gate. And because you had two cards that had 8 gigs of RAM apiece, you were a little bit more future-proofed than the, 8 or 12 gigs of RAM that are on a 1080 reference?
I think the Titan has
12. The Titan has 12.
Yeah, and then
I
the
don't remember if the
Ti
Titan
has 11, and I think the 1080 has 10.
8 or 10, somewhere in there. But at any rate, I mean, that's all AMD did with their Radeon launch. They did a rebrand, and they did a launch. It was very successful. It did its job. It has completely kneecapped the reason to buy an NVIDIA card unless you're willing to spend $400 or more per card. And for the vast majority of us, we just can't afford to do that. It's not feasible. Or, like me, I'm not a big enough gamer to care. Like, to be perfectly honest with you, I gimped day one with my 470. 4 gigabytes of DDR5, by the way, not the 8 gigabyte version. Day one, I gimped it when running Doom. Locked it to 60 FPS. Because I don't care. It doesn't bother me that I'm not getting 120 plus frames per second. I literally do this as a, hey, I want to get out of my world for 5 minutes, shoot some stuff, have a little bit of fun, go home. Like, I miss the LAN party days. And Lord knows, in LAN party days, you didn't, like, if you got 30 frames per second, you were doing great. Like, I remember when your average game ran at 20. It was god-awful compared to now. But
the higher frame rate also gave the poor little guy headaches.
Well, I actually found out why. It's because, for some reason, those monitors... So I was running through some... I acquired them for free. And I acquired 4 Samsung 1440 by 900 19-inch monitors for free. And so there was something about those. They did have a 60 FPS, like they ran at 60 FPS, and that was as low as I could get them to. But there was something about that particular monitor trying to push more than 30 frames per second from a video game that just dorked with me, and really gave me like migraine level headaches. Like, I would play for 15 minutes and be in pain for the next 2-3 hours. Like, it was annoying as all get out. But once I bought the LG, I got LG ultra wide 29-inch monitor. That thing cleared it all up. I can play Doom for days now. I still run it kneecapped at 60 frames per second. I don't care. It's not important. That, and it also helps with the heat generation from the FX8350. Because yes, it can handle doing more FPS, and I'm sure there's an argument to be made about not gimping it, because I'm sure it's still actually creating those frames and just not outputting them or some crap. I don't know, but I'm sure there's an argument to be made that I'm doing more harm than good by gimping it. But I'm still gimping it, because I don't care. I'm not that much of a gamer. Get me to 45 frames per second, I'm happy. I don't need more than that. I actually thought about downgrading to the RX 460 simply because I don't care. I don't need it.
But if you've already got it, why spend the money about something else?
That's the only reason why I have it. Like, it really got to a point of, like, this is ridiculous. Why don't I just buy a crappier card? Like, what gamer in their right mind literally says, I'm going to buy a crappier card. This one's too good. Like, that's just not a thing. So, if that puts any frame of reference that I'm not a gamer, I'm pretty sure I proved that at this point overly and abundantly.
I want to make one correction. It is 8 gigabytes on the 1080. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay.
It's got a high throughput though. And we have been going way too long.
It's our first time getting back in it. It's Ryzen. I mean, come on. Ryzen
I've been
is very
liking
exciting.
this.
Yeah.
I've been very excited about this for a couple of weeks now.
We are, like we said at the beginning of the video, we are a little late on Ryzen. But at the same time,
the UEFI was also late, so we're still ahead of it.
We've had the rest of the YouTube community and the tech
is actually
community
getting money to buy them.
Oh, well, yeah, that. And, you know, we don't have to do any of the work to testing because they've already done it.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, they haven't... Here's the fun part about it. The reality is the real benchmarks are yet to come. That is the sheer reality of this. And the reason why I can say that, and I can say that wholeheartedly, is one, Windows still doesn't know what in God's name to do with this stuff. And the UEFI themselves from the motherboard are still gimping the performance of these chips. So until we get solid UEFIs that are doing more than just allowing it to function, you're not getting real performance out of these chips. Now, once they get those UEFIs, and once Windows knows what's going on, that is going to be an amazing day to watch benchmarks.
That's something to be excited about too, because you know the benchmarks that we're seeing from all these guys
are not even the true performance,
and they're not that bad. They're still pretty stinking good. I mean, it's coming like here's the 6900K, I think, and then here's Ryzen. In most situations.
I mean, when you start looking at this 720p and a 1080p, yeah, the 7700Ks and the 6900Ks, they're still on the show. Yes, of course, absolutely. They're also on a platform that's been optimized for the last 3 years. So if they weren't more stable, if they weren't able to pull extra horses into the race, I would be a little disappointed in Intel, to be perfectly honest with you. But the fact that we haven't even seen the full capabilities of these chips, we haven't even seen full integration, because this is a brand new platform. Right. One of the things you will constantly see from people legitimately that have these chips in their hands and are doing the benchmarks is they will say, the UEFIs are not prepared. This is just like the S99 launch. They were not prepared for what was coming. There was too many new things in a single package, and no one was ready for it. In 6 months, Ryzen is going to look completely different, and it's only going up. Like, the only way this could go down is if a UEFI update literally tanks the entire system. And of course, a motherboard manufacturer is not going to leave that there for too long. Like, they're going to be on that like sting on a skunk. So yeah, I do find Ryzen to be very, it's the underdog, but it's the dog to watch. It's the horse in this race that I think is going to be able to go farther than Intel's current offerings.
Wish I would have bought some stock in Ryzen about 3 months ago.
Oh no, they've been up and down. They've been up and down. I would have done it.
Even now they're...
Well, I mean, if you had short sold it, yeah, that would have been a good idea. But at the same time, now is not a good time to buy, and even like 2-3 months ago, it was not a good time to buy Ryzen or buy AMD stock. What I would have done, if I had a time machine, could go back in time, what I would have done is literally bought as many shares as I could financially and reasonably afford, like 2 years ago, when AMD looked like a pile of crap. When literally the idea of Zen had been around so long that people lost hope. Because think about it, they've been working on Zen for 4 years.
Right.
And one of the things they said in their keynote was that we shot for a 40% IPC gain, and they made 52%. Now granted, that would have been on engineering motherboards, which were made by the same engineers that built the freaking chip. So obviously they're going to be able to do things that a rushed motherboard manufacturer is not going to be able to do. So this just goes back to the idea of give it time to mature. In 2 years, AMD is going to be a real competitor. Not that it's not a real competitor now. Even if the UEFI from AM4 didn't get better, it's still a real competitor, provided the the Ryzen 5 has that high L3 cache. But in 2 or 3 years, when they release a new chipset and everything's kind of been acclimated to this new way of doing it, Intel does not stand a chance unless they change something. Like, that is going to be an amazing day for those of us that like building our own PCs and like doing weird, quirky things. So, with that, I think we will call it a day.
I hope you guys are excited about Ryzen as we are. I hope you enjoyed watching us blabber about it for an hour and a half almost.
Also, if you guys see anything about Ryzen's mobile offerings, I would love to see any articles you guys can find about it. I've been able to find none about any proposed capabilities, you know, what that offering is actually going to look like, anything like that. Because, yes, I like it. It is pretty, but I like AMD better. Just me. They do a high core count. I like high core count.
He and I are polar opposites on everything. He's AMD, Mac, Linux. I'm Intel, Windows. Although I may convert temporarily to AMD for this.
Well, I mean, if AMD's making the better part,
yeah,
and if it's able to do more of a workstation as opposed to spending thousands on Xeons, yeah. I would make a lot of fun of you if you did. Like, literally, if you took that thing out, took out the 6700, and you stuck it as Xeon, I would make so much fun out of you. So much fun. Although, I do, in the same breath, I understand this is very hypocritical, but I do kind of wonder why you didn't get a Xeon. I know that's very hypocritical, but it's totally beside the point.
Anyway, thank you guys for watching. Please like and subscribe if you liked us. If not, then just you can hit the dislike button, I guess.
And we will see you guys next week.